Welcome back to Audiobooks Quiver, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this in-depth summary and review of The Body Keeps the Score.
By Bessel Kolk.
That's right, Bessel van der Kolk.
Yeah.
So have you ever wondered how trauma affects us?
Like, really affects us.
Yeah, I mean, like really gets under our skin and stays there.
This book dives into that very question.
It explores how those experiences...
Traumatic experiences.
Yeah, those traumatic experiences really leave their mark, not just on our minds, but like on our brains and our bodies.
It's amazing how van der Kolk, as like a leading trauma expert,
Exactly.
goes beyond just telling stories. He brings in these compelling case studies and groundbreaking scientific research.
From all these different fields.
Neuroscience, developmental psychopathology, to give us this like really comprehensive understanding of how trauma works.
You know what really grabbed me right from the beginning were the stories about Vietnam veterans.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, these veterans are years removed from combat, but they're still grappling with these invisible wounds of war.
It really makes you think about the lasting impact trauma can have.
For sure.
What's interesting is how these stories aren't just meant to like shock us or sadden us.
Right.
They're carefully chosen to illustrate specific points about how trauma can manifest.
So it's like deliberate.
Yeah. Take the veteran who refused medication for his nightmares.
Oh, yeah.
Because he believed it would be disrespectful to his fallen comrades.
Wow.
It highlights how trauma can warp our decision-making even when we have good intentions.
Yeah, it's like the trauma response is so deeply ingrained that it overrides logic.
Exactly.
So we see the human impact of trauma through these stories, but then the book takes us deeper.
Showing us what's happening in the brain.
You know, like what's going on in there.
And this is where the use of brain scans is really revolutionary.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more about that.
Van der Kolk uses real brain scan images to show how trauma physically alters the brain.
So we're not just talking about some abstract concept.
Right. We can literally see the changes.
There's that story about Marcia, who had a flashback during a brain scan.
And the scan showed a complete shutdown of Broca's area.
The part of the brain responsible for speech.
It makes you wonder what happens when trauma quite literally leaves us speechless.
It's a powerful image.
Like, think about it. If the part of your brain responsible for putting thoughts into words shuts down during a traumatic experience,
Right.
how are you supposed to process or explain what happened?
You can't.
You can't.
It's no wonder so many people who have experienced trauma struggle to articulate their feelings and experiences.
That feeling of being overwhelmed, of not having the words.
It's got to be so isolating.
Incredibly.
And this is something van der Kolk emphasizes.
Traditional talk therapy, where you just sit and talk about your trauma, may not be enough.
Really?
We need to find ways to help the body process and release that trauma.
Okay, so how do we do that?
How do we go beyond just talking about trauma?
Yeah, and actually help people heal on a deeper level.
That's where the body keeps the score. It gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
Van der Kolk introduces us to the polyvagal theory,
Polyvagal theory.
which focuses on the vagus nerve.
I'll admit the polyvagal theory sounds a little intimidating at first.
It's really not that complicated.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Can you break it down for us?
Think of it this way. Your nervous system is constantly scanning your environment for signs of safety or danger.
Okay.
The vagus nerve plays a big role in this process. It's like a communication highway between your brain and your body,
So it's helping you decide how to react.
helping you decide whether to engage socially, fight or flee, or freeze and shut down.
So are you saying that our reactions to trauma are tied to this vagus nerve?
Exactly.
Okay.
The polyvagal theory explains why people respond to trauma in such different ways. Think about the example of a plane crash.
Okay.
Some survivors might immediately spring into action, helping others.
While others might freeze or dissociate.
Right. These different reactions are linked to how their nervous systems, we're finding out,
And specifically the vagus nerve.
are reacting to the extreme stress of the situation.
So it's not just about individual personality.
Right. There's a biological basis for these different trauma responses.
That makes a lot of sense.
And understanding these different states can be a key to understanding how to help people heal from trauma,
It's about recognizing that the body is involved.
and needs to be part of the healing process.
Speaking of understanding the body,
Hmm.
the book also talks about this concept called neuroception,
Yes. Neuroception is essentially our sixth sense.
or sixth sense.
The unconscious process of picking up cues from our environment to determine if a person or situation is safe or dangerous.
So it happens really fast,
In a split second,
before we even realize it.
often before we're even consciously aware of it.
So it's like that gut feeling you get when something's off,
Exactly.
even if you can't quite explain why.
But here's where it gets interesting in relation to trauma.
Okay, tell me more.
Trauma can disrupt our neuroception.
making it difficult to accurately assess safety and danger.
You could end up feeling threatened even in situations that are objectively safe.
Right, because your body is remembering.
Exactly.
So this can lead to like chronic hypervigilance,
Always feeling like you're on edge.
waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Or it can lead to the opposite,
Which is
the kind of numbness or disconnection.
where you avoid situations that might trigger you.
Exactly.
Wow. So trauma can actually change how we perceive the world around us.
On a very fundamental level.
And that's why it's so important to understand these underlying mechanisms.
It's not just about willpower or positive thinking. It's about recognizing that trauma has a real tangible impact on our brains and bodies.
And that brings us to another crucial aspect of the book,
Which is,
the devastating effects of childhood trauma.
of course.
I mean, we all know that childhood experiences shape us,
Right.
but Kolk really dives deep into how early trauma can have these ripple effects throughout our lives.
He emphasizes how our early experiences, especially with our caregivers, lay the foundation for our understanding of safety, trust, and relationships.
So those early years are really crucial.
Absolutely. When those early attachments are disrupted by trauma or neglect,
It can have lasting consequences.
on our ability to form healthy, secure relationships later in life.
It's almost like those early experiences create a blueprint for how we relate to the world and to others.
Exactly.
And one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for this comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study.
The ACE study.
Yeah, the ACE study.
Yeah.
This study revealed a shockingly high prevalence of childhood trauma, and it's linked to all sorts of long-term health consequences,
Everything from mental health issues
like depression and anxiety.
to physical health problems like heart disease and even cancer.
There was one story from the ACE study that really stuck with me. It was about a woman who struggled with obesity for years.
Oh, yes, I remember that one.
And through therapy, she discovered that her weight gain was actually a coping mechanism for the trauma of childhood sexual abuse,
It's like her body was trying to create a physical barrier.
to protect her from further harm. It's
Exactly.
a complete shift in perspective, isn't it?
Makes you rethink things.
It highlights the importance of addressing trauma in a holistic way.
Recognizing the mind-body connection and the complex interplay between our physical and emotional health.
Absolutely. And this is where Kolk's call for a new diagnosis comes in.
Developmental trauma disorder.
Right, developmental trauma disorder. He argues that this diagnosis would better capture the full spectrum of childhood trauma's impact.
Which often extends far beyond the traditional PTSD diagnosis.
Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Sure.
What would be the difference between PTSD and this new diagnosis?
Well, think about it. The traditional PTSD diagnosis is often centered around a single traumatic event
Like a car accident.
or a natural disaster.
Right.
But for many people, trauma, especially in childhood, is ongoing. It's a pervasive sense of threat or danger that permeates their early years.
So it's not just about one isolated incident.
Right. It's about the cumulative effect of repeated exposure to adversity,
And those early experiences can have a cascading effect on development.
impacting everything from emotional regulation to social skills to cognitive functioning,
A diagnosis like developmental trauma disorder would capture this broader impact.
and lead to more effective treatment approaches.
It sounds like this new diagnosis would really shift the focus from individual pathology to the relational context of trauma.
Yes. Recognizing that these experiences often happen within the context of relationships, particularly with caregivers.
And that's a crucial distinction. It's not about blaming parents or caregivers,
Right.
but about understanding how those early interactions shape our brains and bodies, our understanding of the world, and our ability to form healthy relationships.
Absolutely.
And this is where the body keeps the score really shines.
It offers this incredibly insightful framework for understanding how trauma works, how it impacts us on multiple levels, and how we can start to heal those deep wounds. It's a groundbreaking book that challenges us to rethink our approach to trauma and mental health.
Advocating for a more compassionate.
Holistic
Yeah.
and science-based model of care.
And on that note,
We'll take a quick break.
when we come back, we'll explore some of the specific treatment approaches that Kolk discusses in The Body Keeps the Score, and how these methods can help people reclaim their lives and find healing.
So stay with us. So you're probably wondering, what can be done about this?
Right.
About the lasting effects of trauma.
Yeah. How do we actually start to heal?
Well, The Body Keeps the Score doesn't just leave us with the problem.
Right.
Kolk goes on to explore all these different therapeutic approaches
Okay.
that can help people heal.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
No, not at all.
There's hope.
Definitely. And this is where his emphasis on the mind-body connection really comes into play.
So you mean it's not enough to just talk about the trauma?
Right. It's not just about talking.
We have to address the physical impact as well.
Absolutely. Think about it. If trauma literally rewires our brains and nervous system,
Right.
then healing needs to involve more than just words.
Okay, so then what else do we need?
We need to find ways to re-regulate those dysregulated systems.
Like to calm down that overactive fight or flight response.
Exactly.
And to help people feel safe in their own bodies again.
That's the key.
Okay, so what are some of the alternative approaches that van der Kolk discusses?
He talks about a range of therapies from EMDR,
It stands for?
eye movement desensitization and reprocessing,
Okay, EMDR.
to neurofeedback yoga and even theater.
There's a lot of variety there.
The common thread among these approaches is that they focus on helping people reconnect with their bodies.
And regain a sense of control.
Exactly.
I'm particularly interested in EMDR.
Oh, yeah.
I've heard about it before, but I don't really understand how it works.
It's pretty fascinating, actually.
Can you explain it a bit?
Sure, EMDR involves having the client focus on the traumatic memory
Right.
while simultaneously engaging in some form of bilateral stimulation.
Like eye movements?
Yeah, like eye movements or tapping.
Interesting.
And while the exact mechanisms are still being studied, it seems that this process helps to desensitize the traumatic memory and reprocess it in a way that makes it less emotionally charged.
So it's not about erasing the memory,
No.
but about changing how you react to it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And one of the things that van der Kolk emphasizes is that trauma often gets stuck in our nervous systems.
Right.
It's like our bodies are still stuck in that fight or flight mode.
Even though the danger has passed.
Exactly.
So our bodies haven't caught up yet.
Right. EMDR and other body-based therapies help to release that stuck energy
Okay.
and retrain the nervous system to respond in a more balanced way.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
What about neurofeedback? How does that work?
Neurofeedback is a really interesting approach.
Okay.
It involves using real-time displays of brain activity
Well, that's cool.
to teach people how to regulate their own brain waves.
So they can see what's happening in the brain.
Insane.
So, for example, someone who struggles with anxiety might learn to increase activity in the parts of the brain associated with relaxation.
And decrease activity in the parts of the brain associated with fear.
Wow, so it's almost like giving people a biofeedback loop for their own brain activity.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
And it can be really empowering for people
I can imagine.
to see that they have the ability to change their own brain patterns.
Right, it gives them a sense of agency and control.
Over their own healing.
So we've got EMDR, neurofeedback. You mentioned yoga and theater as well.
Oh, yeah.
How do those fit into the picture?
Well, both yoga and theater engage the body in powerful ways.
Right.
Yoga, with its focus on breathwork, movement, and mindfulness, can help people regulate their emotions, release tension, and become more aware of their physical sensations.
And I can see how theater, especially improvisational theater, could provide a safe space
Yes,
for people to explore their emotions and experiment with different ways of being.
exactly. It's not about putting on a perfect performance.
Right.
It's about using the body and voice as tools for expression and healing.
That makes a lot of sense. This all leads back to the idea that the body keeps the score,
Right.
where bodies hold on to the trauma
And we need to find ways to release that trapped energy.
and reconnect with ourselves.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. Trauma fragments us, disconnects us from ourselves and from others.
So it's a process of reintegration.
Exactly. And healing involves finding ways to reintegrate those fragmented parts, to reclaim our bodies, and to rebuild those connections.
This idea of the body holding on to trauma reminded me of a story van der Kolk tells about a psychiatrist named Abram Gardner who worked with World War I veterans.
Oh, yes, Gardner.
He was one of the first to recognize that trauma had a physiological basis.
Calling it a physioneurosis.
His work was groundbreaking in its time.
For sure.
Gardner noticed that these veterans weren't just suffering from psychological symptoms,
Like nightmares and flashbacks.
but their bodies were also reacting in extreme ways.
Yeah.
Like their hearts would race,
Their muscles would tense up.
they'd have trouble breathing.
He understood that trauma was more than just a mental phenomenon.
Right. It was also deeply rooted in the body's response.
To overwhelming experiences.
I remember being blown away by this section where van der Kolk talks about his own research using brain imaging technology.
The brain scans to study the effects of trauma.
He describes how these brain scans can actually show what's happening in the brain during a flashback.
It's amazing.
It really is,
They provide concrete evidence of how trauma disrupts brain function.
particularly in areas like the amygdala.
which plays a key role in processing fear and threat.
Right. You know, when we were talking about Marcia earlier, whose brain scan showed a shutdown of Broca's area during a flashback,
Yeah.
I was thinking about how trauma can impact our ability to communicate on a much deeper level.
Absolutely.
It's not just about being speechless in the moment.
Right.
It's about the long-term effects on our ability to express ourselves, to
Yeah.
connect with others, to tell our stories.
If trauma disrupts the parts of the brain involved in language and communication,
Right.
it can make it incredibly difficult to put those experiences into words,
To make sense of them.
to share them with others.
And that inability to communicate can lead to such a profound sense of isolation.
It really can.
It's like you're trapped inside your own head,
Unable to bridge the gap.
between your internal experience and the outside world.
And that's why finding ways to reconnect with the body and to tap into nonverbal forms of expression can be so powerful in trauma recovery.
It's about finding new languages.
For expressing what words often can't capture.
It's about finding ways to tell our stories, even when words fail us.
Exactly. And that's what so many of these alternative therapies are doing.
Right.
They're giving people new tools for accessing and expressing their experiences, for reclaiming their bodies, and for rebuilding their lives.
I was really struck by how van der Kolk describes the way trauma can disrupt our sensory experiences.
Making it difficult to even feel certain parts of our bodies.
It's as if trauma creates these sensory blind spots.
A way of shutting down overwhelming sensations.
Because if your body becomes associated with pain or fear,
Right.
it's natural to want to disconnect from those sensations.
Because it's a self-protective mechanism.
I remember reading about one case, a woman named Sherry,
Sherry.
who had this compulsive habit of picking at her skin.
Leaving it raw and bleeding.
She couldn't seem to stop.
Even though it caused her pain?
Sherry's story is a powerful example of how trauma can manifest in these self-destructive behaviors.
And it's not about being masochistic or wanting to hurt yourself.
Right.
It's about finding some way to release the unbearable tension and emotional pain that's trapped inside.
In Sherry's case, her therapist recognized that she needed to reconnect with her body.
In a safe and nurturing way.
He encouraged her to try massage therapy.
And it's incredible how something as simple as touch could help her start to soothe those deeply ingrained patterns of self-harm.
It's amazing.
It speaks to the profound need for safe and nurturing touch, especially for those who've experienced physical or sexual trauma.
It's about rebuilding trust in the body,
Reclaiming those lost sensations.
learning to feel safe again. And it highlights how healing from trauma can be a multifaceted journey, incorporating not just traditional talk therapy, but also body-based therapies.
Like massage, yoga, or even dance.
It's about finding what works for each individual.
Recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to trauma recovery,
Right.
and that sometimes the most powerful healing comes from reconnecting with our bodies and learning to listen to their wisdom.
So we've talked about EMDR, neurofeedback, yoga theater massage.
There are so many different approaches out there.
What about medication?
Yeah.
Does The Body Keeps the Score address the role of medication in treating trauma?
Of course, van der Kolk acknowledges that medication can be helpful
Okay.
in managing some of the more debilitating symptoms of trauma.
Like anxiety, depression, or insomnia?
Exactly. But he's also cautious about over-reliance on medication as a primary solution.
So it's about finding a balance,
Yeah,
using medication as a tool when necessary,
right.
but also focusing on those deeper underlying issues that contribute to trauma's hold.
Exactly. It's about addressing both the symptoms and the root causes of trauma.
I was really fascinated by this section of the book where van der Kolk explores the impact of trauma on relationships.
Especially attachment.
Right.
It makes sense when you think about it. If trauma disrupts our sense of safety and trust,
Yeah,
it's bound to affect how we relate to others.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
He emphasizes the importance of secure attachment, especially in early childhood.
Those early experiences of connection and safety lay the foundation for healthy relationships throughout life.
And conversely, when those early attachments are disrupted by trauma or neglect.
It can have long-lasting consequences on a person's ability to form trusting and secure bonds.
It's like those early experiences create a blueprint for how we approach intimacy and connection,
It's like a broken compass.
guiding you toward relationships that recreate those early wounds rather than offering healing and connection.
Exactly.
That's a powerful analogy.
Mm,
It makes me think about how we often unconsciously seek out familiar patterns,
right.
even when those patterns are harmful.
Yeah. It's like we're trying to resolve those old wounds, but we end up repeating the same dynamics over and over again.
Van der Kolk talks about this concept of disorganized attachment.
To illustrate this point.
He describes how infants who experience inconsistent or frightening caregiving from their parents can develop these chaotic and unpredictable patterns of relating,
And those early patterns, as van der Kolk points out, can carry forward into adulthood.
leading to
Difficulties with intimacy, emotional regulation, and even self-identity.
So it's not just about our childhood experiences.
Right.
It's about how those experiences shape our brains and our nervous systems, setting the stage for how we relate to the world and to others throughout our lives.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to recognize the impact of early trauma on attachment.
It's not about blaming parents or caregivers,
Right.
but about understanding how those early experiences shape our capacity for intimacy.
It's about recognizing those patterns and learning to create new, healthier ways of relating.
It's about breaking those cycles of reenactment and choosing to move towards healing and connection.
It's about rewriting the script, so to speak.
One of the most thought-provoking sections of the book explores this idea that trauma can be passed down through generations.
The intergenerational transmission of trauma.
It's a fascinating and somewhat unsettling concept.
It's about how the impact of trauma can ripple outwards, influencing not just the individual, but also their children, grandchildren, and even future generations.
It makes me think of the saying, what's inherited is not just DNA, but also behavior.
Right?
Those patterns of fear, distrust, and emotional dysregulation can seep into family dynamics and continue to shape relationships long after the original trauma has occurred.
It's like an invisible legacy.
Carry forward in the unspoken rules of family life.
The ways people communicate or avoid communication, the patterns of conflict and resolution.
It's about understanding that our individual stories are often interwoven with the stories of our families and our ancestors. And that's why it's so important to break those cycles, to interrupt those patterns and create new, healthier ways of being in the world.
Not just for ourselves, but for the generations that come after us.
It's about healing not just ourselves, but also future generations.
Creating a ripple effect of resilience and connection.
That's a powerful vision.
Yeah.
And it brings up the question of how we can start to shift those patterns, how we can create those ripples of healing.
Well, one way is by starting to recognize the impact of trauma, not just on individuals, but on families, communities, and even entire societies.
And The Body Keeps the Score really challenges us to do that, doesn't it?
It challenges the traditional view of mental illness, arguing that some disorders are actually adaptations to trauma.
Van der Kolk points out that certain behaviors like self-harm or substance abuse,
Which are often labeled as mental illnesses.
can actually be attempts at coping with overwhelming emotions or numbing unbearable pain.
It's like the body and mind are desperately trying to find some way to regulate those intense sensations that trauma has unleashed.
So in that sense, it's about reframing those behaviors.
Not just as symptoms to be suppressed,
Right.
but as expressions of a deeper struggle for survival.
It makes me think of the story of the woman whose struggle with obesity was a way of coping with the trauma of childhood sexual abuse.
Right.
Her weight gain was her body's attempt to protect her.
It's a powerful example. It challenges us to look beyond the surface, to consider the underlying trauma that might be driving those behaviors we often label as problems.
And it highlights the importance of addressing trauma in a holistic way, recognizing that mental and physical health are deeply interconnected.
Absolutely. And that's where van der Kolk's advocacy for a new diagnosis, developmental trauma disorder, comes into play.
You mentioned that earlier.
Yeah.
But I'd love to hear more about it. How would this new diagnosis change the way we approach trauma?
Van der Kolk argues that a diagnosis like developmental trauma disorder would more accurately reflect the complex and multifaceted impact of childhood trauma,
It wouldn't just focus on a single event.
but rather on the pervasive and enduring effects of early adversity.
It would acknowledge how trauma can disrupt development across multiple domains.
Emotional, social, cognitive.
It would paint a more complete picture of how these early experiences shape who we become.
Exactly. It would also help shift the focus from individual pathology to the relational context of trauma.
Right.
It would recognize that trauma often occurs within the context of relationships, particularly with caregivers.
So it's not just about what happened to you. It's about how those experiences played out in the context of your relationships.
And how those relationships, in turn, shaped your understanding of yourself and the world.
Precisely. And it would promote a more integrated approach to treatment.
Incorporating not just talk therapy, but also body-based therapies, mindfulness practices, and interventions that foster a sense of safety and connection.
It sounds like a much more holistic approach.
One that recognizes the interconnectedness of mind, body, and relationships.
And that's really what The Body Keeps the Score is all about, isn't it?
It's about understanding how trauma impacts us on all these levels and finding ways to heal those
To
wounds
reconnect with ourselves.
and to reclaim our lives.
It's about recognizing that even in the face of profound trauma, healing is possible.
But it requires a new way of thinking, a new way of approaching trauma and mental health.
It requires us to listen to the body, to understand its language, and to honor its wisdom.
And The Body Keeps the Score gives us the tools to do just that. It's a groundbreaking work that I believe has the potential to revolutionize the way we understand and treat trauma.
Well, I couldn't agree more. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the profound impact of trauma and to explore the pathways to healing and recovery.
You know, one of the things I really appreciate about this book is that The Body Keeps the Score doesn't just diagnose the problem, it offers a path forward.
There's hope.
There's absolutely hope. It encourages us to consider these innovative approaches to healing.
To think outside the box.
Yeah, to look beyond just the traditional models of therapy and explore what truly works for trauma survivors.
It really struck me how many of the therapies van der Kolk discusses aren't about rehashing the trauma itself,
Right.
but about finding ways to regulate the nervous system and reclaim a sense of safety in the body.
It's a really important distinction.
So it's not always about reliving the trauma over and over again.
Not necessarily.
It's about learning to manage the physical and emotional responses that the trauma has triggered.
Exactly.
Okay, so what are some examples of these more body-focused therapies?
Well, we've already talked about EMDR
Yeah.
and neurofeedback.
Yeah.
But van der Kolk also explores things like yoga, mindfulness practices, even things like dance and theater.
Theater.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that one. How can something like acting help with trauma?
It's not about putting on a performance for an audience.
Okay.
It's more about using the body and voice as tools for expression and exploration.
I see.
Trauma can leave us feeling so disconnected from our bodies.
Yeah.
And theater, particularly improvisational theater, can help us reconnect in a safe and structured way.
So it's about finding new ways to express emotions and experiences that might be hard to put into words.
Exactly.
Because sometimes words aren't enough.
For many trauma survivors, words alone aren't enough. They need to find ways to access and process those trapped emotions and sensations through movement, sound, and creative expression.
I can see that.
It's like finding a different language for expressing what's going on inside.
And that's what so many of these alternative therapies are doing. They're providing new avenues for healing, new ways of connecting with ourselves and with others.
And, all this talk about the body reminds me of the importance of mindfulness.
Mindfulness.
Trauma recovery.
How does that work?
The book talks about how mindfulness practices can help us become more aware of our sensations, our thoughts, and our emotions without judgment.
Just noticing them.
Exactly. Mindfulness is such a powerful tool. It helps us cultivate this sense of presence.
Of being in the here and now.
Of being in the here and now, rather than constantly being pulled back into the past.
Or worrying about the future.
Exactly.
And that sense of presence can be so grounding for trauma survivors.
Absolutely.
Because trauma can often leave us feeling stuck in that fight or flight mode.
Always standing for danger, never really feeling safe in the present moment.
And mindfulness helps us to break that cycle.
To step out of that hypervigilant state and start to notice the sensations of safety and ease that are also present in our bodies.
It's about learning to trust our own internal experience again.
But that's not always easy.
Right. Because trauma can really shake our trust in ourselves and others in the world around us.
It can make you feel like the world's a dangerous place.
Yeah.
But van der Kolk doesn't just leave us with this sense of despair.
Okay, good.
He also emphasizes the importance of social support in healing.
It makes sense we're social creatures.
He talks about how trauma recovery is often a communal process, not something we have to do alone.
We need each other.
We absolutely do. We're wired for connection. And those supportive relationships can be such a lifeline for trauma survivors.
They provide that sense of belonging, safety, and validation.
And it's not just about talking about the trauma either.
Right.
It's about rebuilding trust, learning to connect in healthy ways, rediscovering the joy of human interaction.
It's about finding those people who can really see you, hear you.
And hold space for your pain without judgment.
And that can be so incredibly healing.
One of the most powerful takeaways from The Body Keeps the Score for me
What's that?
was this message of hope.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Kolk acknowledges the profound impact of trauma, but he also emphasizes that healing is possible.
Which is huge.
It's a huge message, especially for those who have come to believe that they're broken or damaged beyond repair.
Yeah.
He doesn't sugarcoat the challenges of trauma recovery,
Right.
but he also offers this powerful vision of resilience, growth, and transformation.
And that gives me hope, not just as someone who studies this stuff, but as a human being.
It reminds me that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit has this incredible capacity for healing and growth.
Trauma might have changed us, but it doesn't define us.
We can learn to integrate those experiences to reclaim our lives and to create new possibilities for ourselves.
Well, that's a beautiful note to end on. If you're looking for a book that will challenge your understanding of trauma, offer insights into the science of healing, and inspire hope for recovery, then The Body Keeps the Score is a must-read.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us for this in-depth summary and review here at Audiobooks Quiver. We hope you found it insightful and helpful. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more book summaries and explorations of the human experience. See you next time.